Let's talk about international law. It's a system of rules designed to protect us all, but sometimes those rules get broken.
The UN's top court has ordered Israel to immediately halt its operations in southern Gaza.
Israel has to comply with this, but Israel will not.
The Russian president,
Vladimir Putin, is now officially a wanted man.
It's a bold statement, the issuing of this arrest warrant, but it will likely have little effect whatsoever.
So naturally, people are asking, what is the point of international law?
International law is meaningless.
Always too little, too late.
More than the will of the strong.
Target our enemies.
So I'm going to The Hague, which is basically the capital of international law, to explain how it all works, why some people think it's flawed, and why others say it's misunderstood. So international law might feel pretty removed from your day-to-day life, but it affects us all in ways we might not even realize. The train I took to get here crossed 2 European borders, but there were no passport checks thanks to an EU treaty called the Schengen Convention. This coffee could have been more expensive were it not for international trade agreements that control import fees for things like coffee beans. Those are just two examples, but this is essentially what international law comes down to. All of these treaties and agreements that regulate how countries deal with each other, from how to share the sea, how to collectively protect the environment, to how they conduct war. But it's not just what's written down. There's also what's called customary law, which is basically unwritten standards and practices that most countries agree on. And so you end up with this web of rules and customs that together make up international law.
No state, not even an island state, is an island. States need to relate to each other. It is international law that provides a framework, a language.
Put it bluntly, it's a way of avoiding chaos. And more recently, it's become a way of instilling minimum standards of humanity.
It's a standard that we should all seek to espouse.
But how it all works in practice is pretty complicated. To understand why, think about how domestic law usually works. In a sovereign country, you have a government with the authority to make the law, which is enforced by police and a hierarchy of courts. And citizens don't have a choice in it all. But in international law, none of those elements are clear. There is no top layer of power that can tell sovereign countries what to do, no global police force, no single court system. Instead, there are lots of courts and tribunals, and countries can mostly pick and choose or change their minds about which courts and laws they want to recognize, with some exceptions for the most serious crimes like torture and genocide.
The paradox of international law is that it's created by states to control states. So it perhaps is not surprising that states aren't always willing to restrict themselves too much.
Molly, you've been here in The Hague covering international law for years. What do you think are some of the biggest frustrations people have with this whole system?
What people often want is, for bad stuff to not happen, and when bad stuff does happen, for the people who do bad stuff to be held accountable, right? I think we all want this. And when you see these horrible images that come out of Ukraine or come out of Gaza, what people want is for this to stop and for the people who did these things to sort of be held responsible for them. And you look towards courts.
Like the International Court of Justice, or ICJ. The court was set up in 1945 as part of the United Nations system, and the ICJ has two roles. It settles disputes between UN member states. It also gives out what are called advisory opinions. That's when another UN body asks the court to clear up a question of international law. A recent example is when the ICJ's judges gave an advisory opinion on Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories, calling it unlawful. There are 15 judges at the ICJ, all from different countries. Judge Abdulqawi Ahmed Yusuf is from Somalia.
It is an extremely weighty responsibility for a judge to apply the rules of law, whether they are actually in favor or not of one of the parties. We are in the Great Hall of Justice, which is actually the hall where all the hearings and the oral proceedings of the International Court of Justice take place. One could describe it as the epicenter of international law, where international law is interpreted and applied in order to avoid wars, to avoid conflict, to avoid problems between states.
The ICJ deals with all sorts of cases. Australia, for example, challenged Japan about its whaling practices. Thailand and Cambodia asked the court to settle a territorial dispute about the land surrounding this ancient temple. More recently, South Africa brought a case against Israel, accusing it of carrying out genocide against Palestinians in Gaza.
Genocides are never declared in advance, but this court has the benefit of the past 13 weeks of evidence.
The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous.
A final decision on that case could take years. In the meantime, the ICJ has ordered Israel to adopt several provisional measures to protect civilians in Gaza, including ordering Israel to halt its military offensive in Rafah.
Israel has not complied with the Provisional Measures Order, but yet it's had its own power, its own influence, that judgment. It's been debated, discussed, it's become part of the dialogue about what's happening in Israel-Palestine.
This brings us to the issue of enforcement. When a country doesn't comply with the UN's top court, what then? Well, the ICJ itself can't do much about that. The UN Security Council can get involved, but there are 5 permanent members who have veto powers, and they can block any attempt at enforcing an ICJ judgment. That happened in the 1980s, when the ICJ ruled that the US broke international law by supporting a paramilitary group in Nicaragua called the Contras. The Security Council held a vote to force the US to pay reparations to Nicaragua, but the US used its veto.
So power matters in international law. And it's certainly the case that certain states are perceived to get away with things that other states can't do.
We are facing in 2024 and then the collapse of the international system. The United States is imposing its veto on resolution related to Israel. Russia is doing the same regarding Ukraine. China is doing the same regarding Myanmar. And that is the reality of the international global system and of the place of international law in it.
How do you feel as a judge when the ICJ rulings aren't complied with?
Well, first of all, I must say they are very rare. Secondly, you always have exceptions to the rule. The most important thing is that the exception does not become the rule, because then the rule of law itself would be in jeopardy. In more than 90% of the cases, the judgment of the court is immediately complied with by the parties. I will give you a recent example. There was a case between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda. The court ruled that Uganda actually occupied part of the territory of the DRC and ruled that Uganda would pay more than $300 million to the DRC. Uganda, of course, can hardly afford $300 million. But Uganda started immediately paying and continues to pay.
Is there a sense that reforms need to be made because there is so much frustration that international law does not help prevent mass violence?
Yeah, I think that if you ask people who are very involved in this world, the thing that they will criticize the most is that political leaders don't seem to be willing to act, right? There's a lot of push to sort of get political leaders to kind of participate better in these systems of international justice.
So that was the ICJ. Remember, it only deals with states. But there have been many other courts and tribunals set up over the years to go after individuals accused of international crimes. So we're talking about the most serious violations of international law, things like genocide and war crimes. The first were the Nuremberg trials in Germany to prosecute Nazi leaders after World War II.
They enslaved millions of human beings.
There was a tribunal that dealt with war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. Slobodan Milosevic, the former Serbian president, became the first sitting head of state to stand trial. In Tanzania, an international tribunal prosecuted people linked to the Rwanda genocide, and there was one in Cambodia that tried leaders of the Khmer Rouge for atrocities in the 1970s. Those were all temporary courts focused on one particular country or conflict. But by the 1990s, the world agreed there needed to be a permanent court to try individuals for the worst international crimes. And that's why we now have the International Criminal Court, or ICC. It was set up in 2002, gets its authority from a treaty called the Rome Statute, and prosecutes 4 crimes: war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression, which covers things like a military invasion. But the ICC is meant to be a court of last resort, so it only intervenes when a country is unable or unwilling to deal with these kinds of crimes on its own.
On this side, we have the prosecutor and his team presenting the case. On the other side, you have the defense. Usually the defendant sits at the last row there. And the witness is underneath the public gallery. This is one of the protective measures so that the public doesn't have a direct eyesight on the witness.
Out of 32 cases, only 6 people have been convicted of the ICC's core crimes. The first was a former rebel leader in the DRC who was found guilty of war crimes, including the conscription of child soldiers. The most recent was the former head of the Islamic police in Mali, who was found guilty of things like torture and mutilation. All of those convicted so far have been from Africa, which is something people have criticized.
This shows that there is something flawed within the system in ICC.
But the ICC rejects that and says the pattern is just circumstantial.
The first investigations were opened at the request of Security Council or at the request of the African governments themselves, so naturally it was focused on the African continent.
So one argument is that it is just a historical accident, that the majority of the early crimes when the statute came into force in 2002 were in Africa. But that's not to deny that there's a very deliberate political element in the sense that there are other cases which could have been investigated.
The ICC now is investigating crimes in places like Bangladesh and Myanmar, Venezuela, and Ukraine. Today, 20 people are wanted by the court. And the most high-profile arrest warrant issued by this court is for Russian President Vladimir Putin.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin is now a wanted man
because of his alleged involvement
in the unlawful deportation of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to Russia.
Now, issuing an arrest warrant is one thing. Actually getting Putin to the ICC to stand trial is another. But before we unpick that, we need to understand how the ICC's jurisdiction works. 124 countries are members of the ICC. Those countries give the court the power to prosecute individuals for crimes committed on their territory or by their citizens. Now, there are plenty of countries that aren't members, including the US, China, India, and Russia. But the ICC can still go after people from non-member states. The UN Security Council can make a request. It did that with Sudan, which is not a member. That's how the ICC was able to issue an arrest warrant for former President Omar al-Bashir for atrocities in Darfur. A non-member can also decide to accept ICC jurisdiction. Ukraine did that, so the court could look into alleged crimes by Russian forces on its territory, and that's what led to Putin's arrest warrant.
Moscow, though, dismissed the announcement as outrageous, saying it doesn't recognize the jurisdiction of the court.
The judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
Right now, it's almost inconceivable that anyone in Moscow will hand Putin over, so the ICC is relying on other countries to arrest him if he travels. But there's no guarantee of that. Putin recently traveled to Mongolia, an ICC member that should, in theory, enforce the arrest warrant. But Putin wasn't arrested. He got the red carpet treatment instead.
The ICC arrest warrants are valid for life, meaning that if the political situation protects someone today, we know that politics always change, and at a certain time this person will not be anymore protected.
In this moment, it seems like you were never going to see Putin in The Hague. I mean, I ask people here, I think, if you think that that's going to happen, and I think most people will say no. This is the exact same thing that they said about Slobodan Milosevic, who died in jail in The Hague under indictment. I mean, you don't know what's going to happen in a few years, that maybe there will be regime change in Moscow, and maybe it is easier for the new leaders to decide that it's, better to ship Putin off to The Hague and have them deal with it than have to deal with it, there.
Think about Nuremberg. Think about the Second World War and the long battle to prosecute the Nazis and the atrocities which carried on right up to the 2000s. So there is a very powerful message here that momentarily, temporarily, we may not be able to activate the machinery and get hold of you. But the framework exists, the promise exists, no matter how long it takes.